you look back over the past several weeks, we spent a lot of time talking about Jesus. Jesus as our Redeemer, as the one who reconciles and restores our relationship with God. And that's really at the heart of the gospel. Jesus takes this relationship that's been broken by sin, and through the cross, Jesus forgives our sins and he restores and brings us back into that relationship with God. But I want to ask you today, is that all that the gospel is about? Is the good news of the gospel just that Jesus comes and saves people and one day he's going to take them to heaven? Well, the Bible's answer is no. The good news of the gospel is not just that Jesus takes people and forgives them and restores them and is going to bring them to heaven. The good news of the gospel is that ultimately Jesus is going to take heaven and bring it down to earth. Because sin has had implications, sin has had consequences, not just for people, but for this world, for the actual creation itself. And you can read about that in the story of Adam and Eve. In Genesis chapter 3, you have the story of Adam and Eve, and they fall into sin and they kind of succumb to the temptation of the devil. And then God comes to them and talks to them about the consequences of their sin. And I want you to notice what God says to Adam in verse 17. He says, "Because you listened to your wife and ate fruit from the tree about which I commanded you, you must not eat from it." Notice this. "Cursed is the ground because of you. Through painful toil you will eat food from it all the days of your life." This verse reminds us that the consequence of sin and its corrupting powers hasn't just impacted people and the human heart, but it's actually impacted creation itself. And you could see evidence of this everywhere. Right now, for example, we think about it in terms of COVID-19, in terms of the reality of sickness and disease in the world. But it's evidence in a lot of different ways as well. If you look at Africa, for example, and certain countries in particular, Nigeria, Somalia, Ethiopia, and Kenya, there are millions of people that are starving, that are dying from hunger. And the reason why is because that area has gone through a season of prolonged drought. There's no water. And without water, it's very difficult to grow crops. And without crops, there is no food. Now, in addition to this, these same areas have also they've just been really impacted by swarms of locusts. Starting in December of last year, these plagues really of locusts have descended upon these regions, and what little ground, or what little crops the ground could produce have actually been eaten by locusts. And then you think about other things. You think about tsunamis. You think about tropical storms. You think about wildfires. All of these natural disasters. And when we really look at it, we can conclude that this world, this creation, it's not as it was meant to be. Paul describes it this way in Romans chapter 8. He says, "We know that the whole creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time." I like that expression. The creation has been groaning. Not only are people struggling and hurting and suffering because of the consequence of sin, but the creation, the world itself is struggling and it's hurting because of the consequence of sin. It's not just people that need to be redeemed. This world, this created world, needs to be redeemed. And that's what God has sent Jesus to do. If you look at Colossians 1, verse 19, Paul says, "For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him," that is, Christ, "and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross." The gospel is the fact that through Jesus, God is going to restore and reconcile all things. And as followers of Jesus, that is the gospel that we want to live out. We want to show that we care not just about people, but that we also care about this world that God has made. And we can do that in a lot of different ways. We can do that by simply not littering. We can do that by getting involved with things like just intentionally cleaning up our neighborhoods. I had a friend of mine, for example, who every time he went on a walk would pick up at least 3 pieces of garbage because he wanted to be committed to being a good steward. I think that's one of the simple ways that you can do that. You can also make decisions, in a world that's so consumed with having everything new. You can be a good steward by simply buying something used where it makes sense. But being a good steward might also shape the decision that you make when it comes to your career. Some of you might choose to work for an organization where you drill wells in countries where water is hard to come by. You might make a decision to study something like sustainable resources or renewable farming practices. Whatever you do, it might look different for each one of you. Whatever you do, we want to be good stewards. And so maybe tonight you could take just a little bit of time to talk about what that looks like for you or for your family.